And the best part about this job, after all the thank you parts, is getting to introduce the two speakers tonight. I am very fortunate, as the coordinator of GRASP, to be able to call them both GRASP ambassadors. They, along with Russ Mittermeier, who's here as well, and Richard Leakey, are the 4 GRASP ambassadors we use to spread the word of great ape conservation. I'm also really privileged to call them both friends. They are fantastic individuals. I'd like to now invite Dr. Richard Wrangham and Dr. Jane Goodall to please come out. Good luck. And while they get seated, I'd just like to point out that they have been friends since 1970, when Richard was one of Jane's earliest students. Richard has, if you don't know Dr. Richard Wrangham's work, he's one of the leading experts in chimpanzee behavior, and he's taken it to a very broad and a public level with some fantastic books like Demonic Males. Sorry about that. And his 26-year study of the chimpanzees at Kibale in Uganda, one of the longest-running studies of chimpanzees in the wild that there is. Dr. Jane Goodall has topped that slightly because she's done a half-century, basically, of work on the chimpanzees at Gombe in Tanzania. Some of her publications, such as In the Shadow of Man, have changed the way we perceive as human beings chimpanzees, apes, and animals in general. So you did not come, though, to hear me speak. I will now turn the microphones over to Richard and Jane, and thank you very much.
So Jane, so nice to see you. Can you believe it? 43 years. As a way to get going, when you were in Gombe in 1960s and 1970s, what was it about chimps that made them seem really special? Because before we start talking about all the doom and gloom in conservation, I think we have to remind ourselves, what is it that makes the apes so extraordinarily special?
Well, I think what's really fascinating is that when I went to Africa, I had no dream of studying chimpanzees. I mean, that was too exotic. I had no degree. I mean, how could somebody like me do something as utterly, utterly exotic as chimpanzees, our closest relatives? And I would have studied any animal. Then I met Louis Leakey. And it was Louis Leakey who, you know, the reason he wanted me to study chimpanzees, which is sort of answering your question, is because he believed, as I believe, and I suspect you do, that 6-7 million years ago there was an ape-like, human-like creature that was the common ancestor. And one part of it led to the chimpanzees of today, and one part to the humans of today. And Lewis always believed that if we found behavior that was similar in chimps today and humans today, that, well, maybe we brought this with us up our long evolutionary pathway, and therefore it would help him to better imagine how early humans behaved, because he spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of our earliest ancestors. And now we know how right he was. Now we know chimpanzees, well, we like to think they're special because we think we're special. I suspect there's many other species on this planet who wouldn't think we were so special. And they would think they were, you know, like the elephants that are so endangered today and the rhinos. It's the International Rhino Day. They would think they were special. But anyway, we think chimps are special because they're so like us. And, you know, we now know, which we didn't really know so much back then, how biologically similar, genetically similar they are to us. And what we've been uncovering at Gombe, and you've been uncovering it in Kibale and the other chimp study sites, how like us in behavior they are. So they not only show similarities in postures and gestures and communication and tool using and tool making, but they show not only the precursors of love, compassion, and altruism in us, but also the precursors of war and violence.
Which you've written about in a really sort of wonderfully sympathetic way. But don't let's get into that right now. What I'd like to do is to see if you can recall one of those sort of magical moments that really brought home for you in a very direct way the sense of connection with the species?
I think the most amazing, really, was in the fairly early days of the study when most of the chimpanzees were still running away from this peculiar white ape. And one of them, whom I named David Greybeard, he had this lovely grey beard. For some reason, he began to lose his fear before the others. And he came into my camp, he stole some bananas, and he came back and got more. And eventually, because he got to realize that I was not so dangerous after all, he actually let me follow him. And before that, I'd come up on the chimps, I'd sat, I'd watched them. When they left, I let them go because I thought, you know, I don't want to push them. But David was allowing me to follow him, and on this one special day, he suddenly veered off the little trail, and you remember the Gombe trails, and he went through a tangle of vegetation, and it was easy for him, but me, well, you know, clothes, and, well, you don't have hair like me, but hair.
Thank you. Do you want to have this interview or not?
Chimps go bald too.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, so I was getting caught up in my clothes and my hair, and I thought, well, I've lost him, but I'll find him another day. So I finally got through this tangle, and David was sitting on the ground, and he was looking back, and I mean, it really looked as if he was waiting for me. Well, maybe he was, how do we know? So I sat down near him, and it was really peaceful. And there was a ripe palm nut lying on the ground. And as you know, chimps love palm nuts. So I picked it up and I held it out towards him on my hand. And he turned his head away. So turn your head away. That's right. So I put my hand closer. And then he turned, he looked directly in my eyes. He reached out, he took the nut. He sort of let it slide to the ground, and then he very gently squeezed my fingers as chimpanzees reassure each other. And it was the perfect communication. I mean, I knew that he understood why I was offering it to him, and I knew he didn't want it. And it was just, I think, that one moment more than any other laid on me a responsibility that I've gained his trust. I must never, never betray that trust.
It is a magical story, and it is the kind of thing that can convert someone for years, decades of investment in chimpanzee well-being. But in fact, it was quite a long time before you really changed your life from research towards conservation. And I think it was, you'd been going, let's see, as long as my current study of chimpanzees, 26 years
Yeah.
Of research before you took that kind of lesson and shifted completely the way that you were running your own life.
And you were partly responsible for that.
A small part.
No, quite a major part, actually. Well, it was that conference. I'd finally written up my results of the first 15, 20 years, whatever it was, in this big book, The Chimpanzees of Gombe, Patterns of Behavior, which was actually, you know, it was only part one.
Yes. We're still waiting for the mother
No, I'll
infant.
never write it now, but anyway, the rest of the students will. They're working on it. But anyway, Understanding Chimpanzees, and it was the Chicago Academy of Sciences. And Paul helped me. He wanted to make it the Apes Conference, and he wanted to bring in early man. And I said, look, don't you think the chimpanzees deserve their own conference? And yes, let's bring in what we then called pygmy chimpanzees, which we now know are bonobos. And actually it was at that conference which made the very clear distinction between these two species. Anyway, we had that conference, and it was to be mainly about bringing together the very few field studies that there were back then and talking about chimpanzee behavior and what we'd learned since I began in 1960. But you and Geza Teleki, you organized this session on conservation, and I think it was Geza who organized the one on conditions in some captive situations. And those 2 sessions are what changed me forever, because sitting and looking at slides, videos, hearing people talk about what was beginning to happen across Africa, the beginning of the bushmeat trade, the exploitation by foreign logging companies of African forests, the ever-expanding human populations and the destruction of the forests and the spreading of agriculture. And it was shocking. We were all shocked, I think. And then there was the session on conditions in captive situations, and what I remember is the conditions in medical research labs. The actual video was sent afterwards, but it was described in that conference, what was going on in some of the labs. The young chimpanzees kept in 22 by 22 inch cages, and the older ones, standard size then, 5 foot by 5 foot, with nothing. And it was, I think I knew about it before, but I hadn't faced up to it before. And honestly, Richard, there was no conscious decision in my mind about, well, I better stop doing this, living in this dream life that I dreamt about as a child, this beautiful forests of Gombe, writing books, analyzing data, which I loved, doing some teaching. It was an ideal life. And I came out in activism. Since that day, I haven't spent more than 3 weeks in one place at a time. But there wasn't a decision. It just, like, I call it my Damascus moment, you know, St. Paul on the road to Damascus.
And it's had fantastic effects. But of course, well, do you ever regret that you didn't start doing conservation work earlier?
Doing it earlier? No, because it was that conference, it was that book that gave me some kind of standing in the world of science.
Yeah.
It couldn't have happened before.
That's right.
I couldn't have made any difference. I couldn't have gone into the labs as I did and face up to these people in white coats who were so sure that what they were doing. I mean, you know, when I went to Cambridge, you know what happened to me. I was told I shouldn't have given the chimps names, they should have had numbers, and I couldn't talk about them having personalities or minds or emotions, because those were unique to us. That was 1961.
So here you were 25 years later, and you'd established a terrific reputation, because that book immediately solidified the reputation you'd already established as being extraordinarily knowledgeable about chimpanzees and leading the way in showing that wild animals could be understood as having emotions and integrating that with an understanding of their natural history.
Well, this is what I was trying to do with the scientists, but as you know, there were many scientists back then who just said, oh, she's just a geographic cover girl. It's only because of her legs. You know that.
You had great legs! You had many things going for you, and you took advantage, which was terrific. So you'd established this wonderful reputation, and it meant, as you say, that you were able to get into the places that needed your attention, as you now saw it. And so on the one hand, there was the conservation issue, and on the other hand, there was the captive problem. And I think, wasn't that the conference which led to the split listing?
It happened fairly soon after that, the split listing, when, you know, should chimpanzees be listed as endangered? I think the conference led to the fact that they were endangered. In many parts of Africa, they were highly endangered. And this led to this whole, for me, it was a nightmare situation, because it was very obvious at that time. It was, you know, the beginning of the use of chimpanzees in HIV research, and Bob Gallo and Montagnier and stuff. So chimpanzees, if we didn't use chimpanzees, we'd never solve the HIV epidemic. And so it was very obvious that if we tried to make all chimpanzees endangered, that this couldn't work, because the biomedical community was so strong and so powerful, and so they would have dumped all the chimps. So Geza and I agreed with a lot of heartache that, okay, let's have the wild chimpanzees in Africa and all the chimps in Africa listed as endangered and the ones in captivity threatened, which was not ideal. And we vowed to fight it. And how long has it taken?
86 to 27 years.
27 years to get the chimps here listed as endangered.
Yeah, so probably everybody here knows it, but I mean, you must be incredibly excited about what has happened now. That it's not
Finally.
actually signed into law yet, I guess, is it?
No, it's not, but it will be.
But it's just about to be the
Yeah,
case that all of the captive chimpanzees are now regarded as endangered as well.
And I think even more exciting for me because, you know, visiting those labs, those were probably the grimmest days that I remember, going to some of those labs. Some were so terrible. And, you know, a lot of the NIH labs or the NIH-funded research. And, you know, now finally, almost the same time as the listing issue, is the NIH agreeing that 300 of its 350 chimpanzees shall be retired into sanctuaries. It's like, you know, okay, it was worth fighting for. We still got 50 to fight for, but we will fight for them, and we will win. And I have to say a special thank you to Francis Collins, Dr. Francis Collins, the director of NIH, but for him, this wouldn't have happened.
So were you able to talk to him directly about that?
Absolutely. I talked to him. We had a long talk. Then he invited me to talk to the NIH staff and their families. And then he convened a committee of medical science and people also on the welfare side to examine all the different chimpanzee protocols that were in use in all the NIH facilities. And the result of that was the chimps actually weren't useful. But we better keep 50 in case one day they might be useful.
Well, I mean, you yourself, these are difficult issues, and you yourself, I think, have been quoted in the past as saying that if it came to saving a life of your child versus a chimpanzee, you would choose your child.
Yes, of course.
And
You would too.
That's right.
And we love chimpanzees, but
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest, you would probably choose your child over my child.
That's true.
And probably I would. We have to be honest, guys. You have to put yourself in that situation. And my contention is nobody should ever have to be put in that situation because it's not ethical.
Right. So, you know, I think one of the sort of wonderful things about you is that you're always quoted as saying that every individual matters, every individual makes a difference. And we
Every
see
day.
that. What's that?
Every day.
Every day. We see that, of course, with you as an individual making a huge difference, and it's just incredibly exciting that the status of captive chimps, even though it's not perfect, is a lot improved over what it has been in previous decades. So that's on the captive side. Let's go to the wild. How did you begin by exploring the issues concerned with conservation in the wild?
Such a crazy thing when I think back on it. I designed an exhibit. You may have seen it because I did come to Uganda with it. It was just pictures blown up and mounted on cardboard, and also a collection of objects actually used by chimpanzees as tools, actual rocks and actual twigs and actual stuff like that, you know, from Thai forest, the nut-cracking chimps and so forth. And I got some money. Oddly enough, it was from Conoco, the oil company. And that's a whole other issue that we have to talk to the extractors in order to try and work with them to, you know, to get them to do things better, but that's another thing. But anyway, they paid for this exhibit. And I think I went into 8 of the different chimpanzee range countries, carting this exhibit with me. And I remember being basically the exhibit and me sort of was impounded in Sierra Leone. Or no, it wasn't Sierra Leone, it was Côte d'Ivoire. Because they said, who is this crazy white woman, and why is she carrying a lot of rocks and sticks in boxes? And they wouldn't let me out. I had to get the American embassy to come and release me. Anyway, But it was as I went around these countries and began talking to, well, political people if possible, but NGOs and people on the ground and anybody, and having wildlife awareness weeks and things like that. And that was when I began to realize something about the fact that it wasn't only chimpanzees who were suffering, it was the Africans too. And it became more and more obvious that this crippling poverty and the terrible disease and the ethnic violence and the population growth and the destruction of the environment and how you're going to cut down the last tree, even though you know that soil erosion is going to damage your future. If your family is starving, you're going to cut down those last trees to try and grow the crops while you can. What else would you do? And so that was when I began to realize that, the old exploitation of colonialism, and you and I, Richard, with our British roots, we know only too well now. I didn't know as a child, and you probably didn't either, did you? But I had no idea of the harm that we were doing with our colonial empire. But we know now. And we find that the same kind of thing is going on with some of the multinationals. And the exploitation, the extraction of the natural resources, making the extractors richer, and usually the local people, apart from a few corrupt politicians, poorer. And so, that was when I thought, well, okay, I better travel around Africa and try and raise awareness here about the plight of chimps and forests, but also in Europe and North America and increasingly in Asia. That's what led to this crazy 300 days a year on the road.
So what you're describing is very much the way that conservation has gone in recent decades. Thinking about the way to strategize about making sure that a habitat can persist is an integrated approach that links in forest, in protected area conservation to activities outside. And it wasn't long, I guess, before you were coming back to Gombe and applying that lesson very directly.
Yes, well, I never forget flying over Gombe and looking down at this little oasis of forest surrounded by completely bare hills and realizing that there were more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere. So how could we even try to protect the chimpanzees when people living around were starving? And we have, with the Jane Goodall Institute now, we've been able to incorporate some of the new technology into trying to create partnerships between us and the local people. And we have one scientist working with us, Dr. Lilian Pintea, and he is extremely passionate about this and works with Google Earth and Esri and Digital Globe and all these kind of things, which to me are, I can see the uses of them, but it takes somebody like Lilian and his colleagues to put this together in a way that everybody can understand. And he's created this wonderful piece of film. And so I hope that we can magically show it now to everybody.
So this is a video that you're going to be using for helping to raise funds or raise awareness?
Raise awareness, particularly raise funds. All that we, you know as well as I do what we have to do for conservation. We have to have money. Awareness is tremendously important. When I first got to Gombe, it was 1960. At that time, there was forest all the way along the lake. And you could climb up to the top of the rift escarpment and look down. There was chimp habitat forest everywhere. I had notebooks and pencils or pens, and I had one pair of second-hand binoculars, and I think they hurt my eyes actually, because I was always trying to see just a little bit more than I actually could. Fortunately, just before the money ran out, I saw one of the chimpanzees, the first to begin to lose his fear of me, and he was actually picking leafy twigs and stripping the leaves to fish for termites, which was making a tool. So that was the breakthrough. Some friends of mine really cared about the research, and they started the Jane Goodall Institute. And today there are so many Jane Goodall Institutes dedicated to chimpanzee conservation, research, and education.
We are working in Gombe since 1960s, and we have been watching what's happening to the forests since then. But it took Jane to take a small plane to actually have that aerial perspective.
I saw Gombe from space through the high-resolution maps from Google Earth, and I was looking at them with Lillian Pintea, and it was a shock because it showed so clearly what I had seen, which shocked me back in the early 90s, that around Gombe, the first pictures, it was literally bare hills. And it should have been forest, and it once was forest. And it was very clear that the land was becoming increasingly infertile due to over-farming and erosion as the forest cover was cleared. And that's when it came to me, you know, how can we even try to save these chimpanzees if people are having such a tough life? So that led to working with the villagers in the early 90s to improve their lives so that in turn they can come around and be our partners in conservation.
Our strategies is that communities are absolutely essential for the survival of chimpanzees. When we go to a village, we first meet the village government. Usually we'd like to share the status of the work which we do together. And that gives you that extra sense of connection, that feeling that you're actually part of the same team. You're just working from different perspectives.
We worked with villages around Gombe National Park to make a meaningful and contiguous forest conservation. So we came up with the idea to have the forest monitor.
Kijijini nafanya shughuli za kuratibu msitu, ni kuangalia uharibifu wa msitu unaofanywa na baadhi ya watu waliomo ndani ya kijiji, kusimamia ili wasiendelee kufanya uharibifu ule. Kwani uharibifu ule wakiufanya unasababisha hata vizazi vijavyo havitauona uoto wa asili ambao unatakiwa uwepo.
The Jane Goodall Institute is putting the technology in the hands of the people at the local level. And they are empowered to make the decisions about what's right for their own environment.
The forest monitor is equipped with an Android smartphone or tablet. By being able to use simple tools such as Open Data Kit, we're trying to empower local communities in doing the work which in the past only specialists could do.
Vifaa hivi vinasaidia, na niseme kwamba vinasaidia sana kwa sababu wakati wa kwanza nilikuwa nikifanya doria nikitumia kuandika kwenye karatasi. Kila ninachokiingiza humu kinakuwa kina uhakika kwa sababu kinaonyesha mahala nilipokuwa.
After the forest monitors collect the field data, they upload it into the Google Cloud.
It's not just useful for that village, it's actually contributing towards a global effort of monitoring forests and natural resources around the world.
The Jane Goodall Institute is not only using Open Data Kit to collect all of their field data, but they're also using Google's entire suite of mapping technologies. And so they're really at the cutting edge of using technologies to save chimps and their habitat.
We are using geospatial technology to bring on the same map science knowledge and indigenous knowledge to understand how we are achieving our mission. We looked over the chimpanzee range and we figured out that by working with 9 countries, we can save up to 85% of chimpanzees. And this is our focus.
They've used Gombe as their laboratory, and now we're together scaling it up. We want to scale it up across the entire Congo Basin, which is where so many of the remaining chimpanzees live. And because we have the Google scale technology, we could have thousands of people submitting data, and it can immediately be shared with billions of people around the world. This all started with Jane Goodall in the 1960s, just a pencil, paper, her notebook, and her binoculars, observing things that no one had ever seen before. Now, we can all see what's going on in these landscapes with the satellite imagery that's coming every day, the data that local communities are collecting on the ground, and it creates this real-time picture of a place that can transform conservation.
All the Jane Goodall Institutes working together are really trying to do whatever they can to conserve forests. And if you conserve a forested area in order to protect chimpanzees, of course you protect everything else. Every single individual makes a difference every single day, and we have a choice as to what sort of difference we're going to make.
So it's very exciting seeing that, because you're getting the pathway, taking a lead in the way you're doing these things. I think it's just worth mentioning that when Elizabeth Ross and I edited a book called Science and Conservation in Africa, in African Forests, 4 years ago, we represented, I think it was 6 chimpanzee sites and 2 gorilla sites, and in every one, they were following your lead there. In every case, the research has led to people doing some sort of community work, conservation outside the forest. And of course, what's so nice about that model of research leading to conservation is that the type of conservation is well adapted to the local circumstance. So you've been able to adapt it perfectly for the arrangement in Gombe. Can you tell us how things are going there? I mean, do you feel that as a result of this investment, you are starting to succeed in stemming the flow of poaching, of forest cutting, of whatever the threats are?
Well, I think, you know, there was an awful lot of footage that isn't in that little tiny short film. And one of the really exciting things is that sitting down with Lillian, who's out here somewhere, and so is Rebecca Moore from Google, but there they are waving. Okay, hi. Yes. Lillian was able to sit down. He was able to get high-resolution maps from, you know, satellite imagery, GIS, GPS, and all the rest of it. And the village women everywhere, they could sit down, and a woman would say, I can see the tree where I put my baby to sleep while I'm working in the fields. And they saw their sacred sites, the tree or the rock. And because our program to help the villagers improve their lives, which began in '94, Tukari, because it really has helped improve lives, it's helped to, you know, produce more food in the same small space. It's helped with water projects and protecting the watershed. In particular, it's helped to empower women, keep girls in school. And we all know that as women's education improves all around the world, family size tends to drop, which is, people shy away from talking about human population growth. We cannot shy away from it. It underlies so many of our problems. But at any rate, we were actually congratulated by the Tanzanian government for taking the lead on family planning, which we've introduced. We even have had 11 men go and ask for vasectomies. Imagine that in Africa, okay?
That's a tough one, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
but they did.
Right. How many children had they had before they asked
No,
for
one of them
vasectomies?
had 5, but he knew he wasn't terribly well and he couldn't afford more. And the others followed his lead. So we didn't have more money to do more vasectomies. But, anyway, that's enough about that. But so because these, we started with 12 villages around Gombe. And then it became, I can't remember, 20-something. And now we're in 52 in the whole area going down south. But around Gombe, because the people were so happy with Tukari, they sat down with Lillian and the person he trained, and they agreed, in Tanzania you have to put 10% minimum of your land for conservation. And they agreed to put their 10% in such a way that it was a buffer around Gombe. And the chimps today have 3 to 4 times more land, more forest, than they had 10 years ago, because the trees grow so fast. And there is the beginning of a corridor. We talked a lot about corridors today, I think. A corridor leading down to remnant groups further to the south. And 2, maybe 3 months ago now, I got a letter from the field from Dr. Anthony Collins, who's Gombe's guru. And he said that a female arrived in Gombe, her fecal samples were collected, another example of new technology, which proved she was not a Gombe chimp. She was nothing to do with any Gombe chimp. We have all of their DNA profiles. And she had used the corridor and moved from...
That's amazing.
And it's the first one, but I mean, these are the signs of hope. And she's integrated and she's brought new blood in, and if one can do it, 2 can do it. And ours can move out.
Yeah.
So this, this shows it works.
How much do you know about the southern population? How many are there?
I don't actually know. We don't know, nobody knows exactly how many there are. But our program now goes way down south where there are, Lillian could probably tell you, because I think he told me the other day, but way more chimpanzees than we thought, where the forests haven't yet gone. So using the same Dakari methods of working with the villagers and the Google method of training forest monitors, we're hoping to preserve those forests. So around Gombe they're restoring, and down in the south they're preserving, and put the 2 together. That's hope for Tanzania's, chimpanzees in this area.
That seems really promising. And as I understand it, you had a bit of a bad time, what was it, about 10 years ago, something like that, when there was some poaching in the southern part of Gombe, but the research communities, they stayed the same. They didn't suffer.
Yeah, they didn't suffer at all.
So the habituation was a really good thing in protecting the chimps.
Yeah.
And now they will be able to recolonize the southern part together with these ones coming from other forests.
That's what we hope.
What you hope, yeah.
That's the hope.
So I mean, the difficult thing about Gombe is that it's so small that a hard-nosed view might say, let's take a triage perspective and put all of the still relatively few dollars and manpower hours available for ape conservation into the big areas. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that we have around, I don't know, Lillian, 3,000 chimps in that whole area, 5,000?
About 2,000, but maybe more.
2,000, 3,000. Anyway, that's not too small a number.
That's big.
And, those are what we're concentrating on there. But then we've taken this whole, conservation effort into DRC, into Uganda, and then, of course, in Chimpunga, in Congo-Brazzaville, we move into the whole bushmeat trade, and DRC the same. So Whereas in Tanzania, the bushmeat trade is not a big problem for chimpanzees, not at all. It's merely human population growth and forest destruction. But in Central and West Africa, as you know only too well, it's the bushmeat trade. And the bushmeat trade leading to these huge numbers of orphan chimps, like the orphan chimps in the orphan orangutans. We have to look after them in sanctuaries.
Well, yes. So just before we move into sanctuaries, I just want to say that it seems to me really worthwhile focusing on the fact that even a small population like Gombe, which then turns out to be part of a larger meta-population of several thousand from originally just 100 or 150, is worth really focusing on if what it's going to do is to develop new methods that can be applied much more broadly. Mm-hmm. And of course that's what's so wonderful about what you've done, because through the Jane Goodall Institutes and through your work in the different countries, you can take this model and apply it more broadly. Just wanted to get that plug in, because it's really important.
Yes, and also, Richard, when you said that, you remind me, if you look across the primate spectrum, how many people had their origin by being at Gombe? We had all the students at one time, you were one of them. And today, if I look at, all the papers that are written, so many of them are ex-Gombe students, and today the students of the ex-Gombe students. Yep. And even those people who went to Gombe and didn't continue in a career in primatology are feeling that it changed their lives. So one's like Nancy Merrick, who's just about to produce a book about chimpanzee conservation. Yep. So Gombe itself, that little place, has really affected thousands of lives by now.
Yes.
And saved thousands of chimps.
And as you say, in many different ways.
Yes.
People like Caroline Tutin and Bill McGrew started projects elsewhere. So what about the sanctuaries? You were just starting to raise that issue, and it's a bit like the way that some people think about Gombe versus the whole of Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are people who say that it's really not worth saving the lives of a few chimps, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, because the amount of money that you spend could be so much better spent elsewhere. I'm sure you've got an answer to that.
There are various answers, aren't there? The answer that's very close to my heart is exactly what you've quoted, and the film said, every individual matters, and every individual has a role to play. I never wanted to become involved in sanctuaries, but I remember so vividly, I was in Kinshasa, and I'd gone there because somebody wrote to me and said, Jane, there are all these orphan chimps, and their mothers are being shot, and they're being sold in the markets, and please can you come, because something has to happen. And I thought, well, there's nothing I can do. But then, then this African thing started for me. So I went there, and I will never forget driving past and seeing this little chimp. He was about 1.5 years old, I suppose. And he was curled up in a fetal position on top of a little tiny cage in a market. And he was surrounded by tall, how tall the Congolese are. And they were laughing, it was hot and dusty. And we stopped the car. And I went over, and I thought he was dying, actually. He was just lying, his eyes were glazed. And I went up to him and bent down, and I did the little greeting. And he sat up and reached out to me like this. Well, it was like David Greybeard holding my hand. What could I do? I couldn't turn my back. So we actually went to the American ambassador, and it is against the law. So he went to, some official, and we got a policeman. And that was when Graziella Cotman said she would look after this infant if we could confiscate him. And that started my whole involvement with sanctuaries in Burundi, in DRC, in Congo Brazzaville, in Uganda. We started that one way back when. And it's a nightmare situation, but what can you do when they look in your eyes and reach out like that? You would feel the same. You do.
I do. Exactly.
And then there's the whole other thing that it's raising awareness. And we've had so many people come into our Chimpunga sanctuary in Congo, Brazzaville, from the local area and say, I'll never eat a chimpanzee again. Because people don't know. We have television, we look at stuff all the time. People in America have no excuse not to know what chimpanzees are like if they're interested. But out there, the hunters just see glimpses in the trees. Some of them know a bit more than others. Most of them have absolutely no idea. They don't know how like us they are.
Yeah.
They don't know that they kiss and embrace and hold hands and look after each other.
And movies are very important. We can talk about that in a minute maybe, but that's right. Somewhere like Claudine André's sanctuary, Lola Yabonobo, thousands of school children visit there every year.
Yes.
What a huge impact that has to make. And I, as you know, totally agree with you about sanctuaries. I think that one of the major advantages they have is they present conservationists as ethically consistent. It would be quite inconsistent to forget about those pathetic individuals who've been tied up in villages or exhibited in hotels or whatever it is, while we try and conserve the forest as a whole.
But that's the difference between welfare and conservation, because there are conservationists who only think about the good of the species. I've met them. They don't care about the individuals. They may personally care, but ethically they don't care.
But I think people who work with great apes tend to escape that particular
I hope so.
aspect. And then the other thing that sanctuaries are wonderful for is they become repositories of information about conservation throughout the country. And as you say, they're sources not just of education for children and the general public, but sources of advice for conservation action. They're tremendously important in all sorts of ways. But they're under threat.
Richard, you told me this morning something which has really moved me about this gorilla sanctuary. Can you share that with people?
Well,
please.
This is very moving. So
Yes.
sanctuaries in general are doing quite well for the last, 15 years, something like that. We've got the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, PASA, that has really done terrific things to raise standards of care. But in some places, the sanctuaries are under threat because they are treated in words that were delivered to Claudine André just this week, like pet shops, where there is the risk that after all of the care that has been done to bring these orphans into a state of good health and into possible candidates for reintroduction, they may be cynically taken away and delivered to perhaps foreign zoos. Rumors are abundant about China being involved. This is particularly threatening at the moment to the sanctuary called Grace in eastern Congo, which is the only one that has gorillas from the eastern lowlands, Grauer's gorillas. 2,000 left in the wild, 14 in the sanctuary at Grace, a sanctuary that was created as a result of the local community donating ancestral land and welcoming this sanctuary. Well, they're under a lot of threat at the moment, and as Jane says, something very moving happened today, and we've got a couple of slides which are just going to illustrate this. The threat is that the Protected Area Authority of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is going to come and take some of these gorillas away without proper arrangements for their well-being. And the local community are very worried about this. So here we see the Grace Sanctuary, and there's a gorilla top left there. You see there's a fairly large area, 140 hectares of natural habitat. This is not like going to Kinshasa Zoo. And when the community heard about this, here's one thing they did. This morning, next slide, I've got a clicker. Instead of going to church in the church, they came around the sanctuary and prayed together around the sanctuary that the gorillas would not leave. That's what happens when you get a community.
It's amazing.
So they're really, really scared, and many people are really scared, and hopefully we can assemble the kind of coalition that will persuade the relevant authorities in the Congo to allow the sanctuaries to do this really valuable work of presenting apes as well cared for individuals representing their species and being able possibly to go back into the wild.
Yes, well, that's the next part of our story. Because what we're struggling for with our Chimpunga sanctuary, that's the biggest chimpanzee sanctuary in Africa. And I actually would like to thank Doug Kress for all the work that he did when he was head of PASA, because he
nurtured and brought it up to fruition.
He really did,
yeah.
yes.
Well done, Doug.
And so, you know, we've got it's 160 something now. It keeps growing, and it's terrifying number. I know it's nothing like all these orangutans, but for us it's an awful lot of chimps to look after. And the sanctuary, the places, the enclosures we had were bursting at the seams. And the two people in charge of the sanctuary, well, three I suppose, but Rebecca and Fernando are actually in charge. Rebecca's a veterinarian, and Debbie Cox, who's been working with us for years, she's right there now. And she's there because thanks to the Congolese government, this is Congo Brazzaville, this is Republic of Congo. Thanks to the government, we've got these three big islands. One is really big, and I ought to know the size, but I'm no good at numbers, so I'm not going to say, but it's huge. And this is on the Kwilu River, which is one of those beautiful African, you know, it's a huge river, and as you go up further, you can see where elephants have come down and crossed the river, and it's gorgeous and wide and big. And two of these islands are now more or less ready for chimpanzees to be moved onto them. They'll still need some food. And the first of these islands, the biggest of them, which will take most of our chimps, already has 17 individuals on it. And when I was last there, which was about, 4 weeks ago, I had the enormous privilege of going with the 17th, female. Her name is Wanda, which in the local language means close to death, because at one point she was very close to death. And I had the opportunity of going with her from the sanctuary, which means, tranquilizing her, putting her in a traveling cage, putting her in a car, taking her along the road, loading her in a boat, taking her up the river. And the moving thing to me is that she didn't know what was happening to her. There she is, she's been through an awful lot already. And we had no way of saying, it's going to be great. So they kept the other 16 away to start with so she could just get onto the island and get the feeling. And she's terrified of elephants, and she would realize there were no elephants. And of course we were going to leave a couple of keepers with her and to transition her into this new life. And so we have a little piece of video, 5-minute video, which I want to show because for me, as you'll see, it was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had. So we can show our little piece of video. And thanks you guys, you're doing a great technology job up there. And you haven't seen this, Richard, have you?
This is wonderful.
Her name is Wunda, that it means close to die.
Wunda.
Wunda, that it means that close to die in local language, in Bili. And actually, her name is fit exactly with her because she was in different situations that was very close to die. The last time she had a very serious illness. She was really bad. She lost weight, and she was look how she becomes.
This is unbelievable.
Unbelievable. Yeah. We did a blood transfusion of her. It was the only thing that we could do for save her, and she's alive. And now we are going to give her the paradise
on the island.
On the island. Yeah.
This is a really exciting moment for me. Here is Wunda, and she nearly died, but thanks to Rebecca, she came back from the dead almost. I mean, I saw her looking almost dead, but anyway, now she has a will to live, and here she is about to come out into this paradise. She's the 15th chimpanzee to get her freedom here, and we hope ultimately to have about 60 on the island, all waiting, and I'm hoping that for my 80th birthday, which is next year, that we can raise enough money to bring all of them out and give them all their freedom. And that will be the best birthday present that I could have. So I hope that you help us, please. And I have to say that now she's back with the group. She's with the other 14 or whatever it is, and hopefully this phase of her life will be good.
Those are the moments worth waiting for, aren't they?
Yeah.
Many of the individuals that have ended up in sanctuaries are there as a result of the bushmeat trade.
Yeah.
But that suggests that the bushmeat trade, that wrongly suggests that the bushmeat trade is the really important factor in conservation of the species as a whole. Because ultimately, it's pretty clear that the real threat is the conversion of forest into agricultural lands. Your former student, my former colleague, Nancy Merrick, happened to be in Uganda just this week. And she sent some slides today which just illustrate the fact that forest conversion is threatening, in this case, chimpanzees, because they're just losing their homes. If we can have the next little set of slides, here we got areas of northwestern Uganda, where Lilia Jarova, who may be in the audience, has been working very hard to protect these forests, but it's a very difficult battle. Here are just some examples of clear cutting for planting of new crops. Next. You've got a couple of chimps who are seeing a strip of forest, their only strip remaining. You can see through the forest. Next slide. So there you can see just how thin the strip is. Next slide. So this was a group of some 30 that are reduced to 19, and the trees that they have been relying on for fruit, many of them are going to be cut in the next wet season. Next slide. So they end up in the villages because there's nowhere else for them to live. And we've seen this around Kibale, and here this is being seen in the Hoima district. And it's a pattern that is repeated in many different places outside the protected areas. So what this raises is the future for the apes in areas that don't have the terrific dedication of people like you in small areas.
So what do we have to do? We have to, a key thing is corridors so that these isolated populations can actually form a viable population, right? And so what do we have left to do? Well, one, we haven't talked about ecotourism, but these villages, as we found around Gombe, once they had other ways of making a livelihood, they stopped cutting down the trees. And if we can make it, and the Red Plus program we're using a lot in southwestern Tanzania, we're readying the villages, so hopefully the carbon polluters will put money into protecting rainforests. That's not the ultimate solution to our planet's problems. It's a temporary one, but even if we can get something going temporarily to save the chimpanzees and the gorillas and all the rest of it in this desperate time. So if the villagers realize that the trees growing can provide them with as much income as cutting them down and selling them, and protect the water sources and give them, better quality of life. And the ecotourism can come in and see these chimpanzees, and that adds to the income of the villagers. I mean, we have to grab at everything.
At everything, and everything includes ourselves.
And everything includes ourselves.
The first world consumers.
Yes, and I know one company, and I don't know what's happened to it, I have to find out, but they had agreed that they would put standing trees in Uganda as part of their net assets in the company's books. Now that's a super idea. Mm-hmm. So it means that a standing tree in Uganda is an asset for you where you are in Austria.
So yes, there are going to be new ways of organizing the economics to provide incentives for conservation.
And quickly. It's not something we can deliberate over for the next 5 to 10 years. We have to deliberate now. Those chimpanzees will disappear otherwise. And because there's so few left, there are people who say, well, they're going anyway, so let's not bother, let's put money somewhere else. We can't do that. That's not the way to go.
So here you are organizing your life both to direct your attentions to Gombe and to speak to the world as a UN ambassador for peace and so on. You're thinking about human populations. What do you think about the possibilities for persuading consumers in the first world to change their behavior in ways that will reduce the rate of forest conversion to agriculture in the tropics?
I think it's really, really important. And of course, one of the ways, which an awful lot of people don't actually truly understand, is that as people around the world, in the developing world, get more and more economically independent, rise up out of poverty, one of the things that's happening is that where they used to live on diets of rice and so forth, now to show that they're wealthy, they want to eat more and more meat. Now look at us in the developed world. Look at the amount of meat. Look how much meat is wasted in any restaurant in any day. Especially America has these huge portions of, You know, go to Texas and look at the size of what you get on your plate. Nobody can finish it. And if they do, they're obese. So, I mean, you know, you can't win. And, you know, I honestly didn't realize until I looked into it that if everybody on this planet reduced the amount of meat or didn't eat any, it would make a huge difference, because huge areas of forest are being cut down to provide grazing for cattle, or to grow grain for cattle or pigs or whatever it happens to be. And of course that's a huge damage to climate change, and eventually climate change will harm the habitats of the chimps and gorillas as well, so it's all interconnected. And they're producing extra methane gas, which is worse than CO2. So actually, so I even carry, I mean, this is cow, and cow was actually given to me for a completely different reason, and I was going to give cow away, and I thought, well, cow's now my spokesperson. It's not only cutting down the forests, and it's the cruelty to the animals too.
So there are things we can do, and eating less meat is one of them.
Yes.
There are lots of other things too. I'm getting a signal to wrap up.
We've got to talk about the future generations. We cannot stop without talking about the fact that there is no point in any of us doing what we do. Not one single person in this room, whether you're doing a sanctuary or conservation or anything, if we don't realize that if the next generations don't become better stewards than we've been, we might as well all give up and just relax and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, eat as much meat as we like, and do anything we like. So our program, Roots and Shoots, to me, is, you know, I think this is one of the most important things that I can spend the rest of my life doing, is growing a critical mass of young people who understand that what's gone wrong is this materialistic society which we are now spreading. And it's not the developing countries that are at fault, it's the developed or the almost developed countries that swoop in to take the natural resources. And there's a lot of corruption. We talked about that all day.
Jane, you've written Reason for Hope, Harvest for Hope, Seeds of Hope. You are an icon of hope. What is the sort of final hope message that you want to leave? Is it that the young will take us forward?
Well, the young are. I mean, you know, as I'm traveling around the world, all these crazy places all these days, everywhere I go, there are groups of Roots and Shoots or other, you know, we partner. Partnership's important. We partner with other youth groups. But ours is preschool through university. It's young people choosing projects to make things better for people, for animals, for environment. And learning to live in peace and harmony, not only with each other, but also with the natural world. That's why I'm an ambassador, a messenger of peace. And everywhere I go, there are young people who have done amazing things. And some of them are working with the apes, and some of them are working for forests, and some of them are working against intensive farming. And if we listen to them, if we help them understand, and then we listen to their voices, and we empower them to take action, there's a whole new feeling of hope and determination out there, which wasn't there when I was a child. It's as though the desperate situation of the planet, not just for apes, but everything else, is calling forth some new power and strength in our youth, which I don't think was there before. So my greatest hope for the future is that we get this critical mass of young people that understand that the values in this life shouldn't be related to money. We need money to live, but we shouldn't live for money. And that other things are so much more beautiful and so much more fulfilling for our spirits. And that's what's happening. And that's my reason for hope.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Chimps. Some cow. Thank you. That's hope too, isn't it?